You are listening to Talking Star Wars.
So today we are going to talk about the Sith. It might not take as long as talking about the Jedi as last time because inherently there are fewer Sith to go around.
So looking at canon, they pared down quite a bit. Took two things from Legends and got rid of the rest. So about 7,000 years ago, a group of Jedi left the Order and became the Sith. I think they got rid of the actual Sith alien species because it's now only referenced in a children's workbook from The Force Awakens.
Yeah. So where the Sith philosophy actually arose is not specified. We do know that the Jedi did come first, and the Sith rose in opposition to them.
Yeah.
So this is why their philosophies are often paired, because the Sith even have a creed that is a direct rejection of the Jedi Jedi code, which we do get more referenced more in more modern media, and I'm glad they're making the Jedi code and the Sith code canon again.
Yeah.
So the Sith, I would say the reason that they are very specific what they believe is because they deliberately reject the teachings of the Jedi to specifically rebel against the Jedi. Because the Jedi have been such an institution for so long, which is why they exist.
Right.
And which is why conflict between them is inevitable. And it's a very specific philosophy, much like the Jedi have a very specific philosophy, in that it is about using the Force to obtain personal power. I don't think the Sith necessarily see themselves as evil, though some of them certainly do embrace that title. I think many of them see themselves as pragmatic. At least, certainly, Dooku does.
And they're doing it in a naturally manipulative, aggressive, oppressive way, which some would consider to be evil, but doesn't necessarily have to be. Although we certainly don't see many gray Sith.
No, I think Asajj Ventress is the closest that we get.
The Visions Ronin is a gray Sith.
Another example.
Not exactly canon, but still a legend within the Star Wars canon nonetheless.
Yeah, so you just see fallen Sith as well as seeing fallen Jedi. So under the broad umbrella of the Sith, generally there's two of them at a time. There used to be more Sith, but because of their philosophy, they tended to kill each other and engage in civil wars.
And Darth Bane is canon. Darth Bane is everything that was known about Darth Bane has been stripped, other than he is the proprietor of the Rule of Two, saying we are not going to be an army, an armada of Sith, we are going to be master and apprentice. And that is what it was from then, which I believe was 3,000 or 4,000 years before the Star Wars story, until Palpatine and Vader, or Snoke and Kylo, depending on... They're not exactly Sith. I think they're more of an offshoot.
Yeah. But much like the Jedi philosophy, which existed and rose out of a particular time and place, so did the Sith Rule of Two philosophy. It came in the wake of a great Sith civil war, where without the intervention of any Jedi whatsoever, the Sith pretty much annihilate themselves in the quest for... because they always want power, and it's their philosophy is that the most powerful needs to rule, but also that they each consider themselves the most powerful and none will serve the others.
Which, to see that in anything, just the mad pirate battle of the Great Sith Civil War, where it's like the battle of 5 armies in The Hobbit, but it's just 5 Sith armies fighting, would be incredible.
But, of course, there are more dark side users than just the two Sith. So it is specifically said that there are 2 people who are allowed to call themselves Sith, meaning they get the title of Darth. So the Darth that we meet is Darth Pelagius, who was the master of Darth Sidious. And then Darth Sidious, Palpatine, has several apprentices. Darth Maul, who was then kicked out of the Sith and nearly killed.
Then known as Maul.
That notice Maul and deliberately, but even Maul will get a character spotlight episode later. The Sisyphus of Star Wars.
I was going to say he is definitely a fallen Sith, but he is still quite murderous in what I would consider evil.
Yeah, we would compare him to Asajj Ventress in that even when he is no longer a Sith, he gets an apprentice and attempts to seize control of an empire.
Yeah, and I think in episode didn't they point out to him just like, you know what you're doing, right?
And no, Palpatine points out what he's doing before he defeats him and locks him up to use as a pawn. But so, and then other Sith that we know, so then we have Darth Tyrannus, who is Dooku, who is seduced to the dark side after Maul's death, and who Palpatine had as an iron in the fire. Palpatine always has an iron in the fire for another apprentice.
You definitely get the sense that Dooku views himself as an equal to Palpatine in some ways, just because of how they're opposed in the Galactic Civil War, Separatists versus the Republic, until Big Daddy Palpatine gives him the order to assassinate Ventress, who is Dooku's not exactly secret apprentice, more of an assassin, would you say?
Yeah, he calls her his assassin, but really she's his apprentice, because Dooku has ambitions. Yeah, and so you even see that even the existing Sith, they bend the rule of two, trying to get their own power. Palpatine's like, oh, I only have one apprentice, but also I have the Grand Inquisitor who's trained all of these Inquisitors who are, less powerful Force users, sometimes deliberately kept less trained.
Oh, yeah.
Who are just good enough to go hunt down nascent Jedi. This also kept as like a stable of, if I ever need a replacement for Vader, it's pretty much established that then that would have become, the Grand Inquisitor would have become Palpatine's new apprentice. Not because he was as powerful as Vader, but because he needs an apprentice, and hey, this guy's here, and he's the next most powerful thing.
He needs a face in the Empire. He's not going to be out doing everything. He needs the symbol of fear, that the boogeyman who will be hiding under your space bed.
Yeah, and I think there's mixed feelings about the establishment of the Inquisitors, because it's a rule of two, but I think it's more realistic that you can't just have Vader and Palpatine. Much like you still see all these other surviving Jedi and other Force-sensitive people rise up during the time of the Empire. Yeah. Palpatine needed more than just Vader to help control his empire. And so he deliberately keeps this controlled and traumatized former Padawans and dark fallen Jedi around as Inquisitors, but doesn't call them Sith, doesn't let them call themselves Sith, and he doesn't give them the same... even though he and Vader hate each other, he gives Vader a certain amount of respect. Yeah. Even though he's clearly the secondary partner. He does not give the same to the Inquisitors. They are expendable cannon fodder. But I would still count them as in the Sith orbit. They're using Sith techniques. They are trained by Sith.
They're not independent of themselves.
Yeah, it's more like, you got your major league team who are allowed to have two people. Then they maintain a minor league roster that they can either draw from or just send out to do the dirty jobs. Yeah. So as far as the Sith philosophy goes and how they're depicted, again, I would say the rule of two, they even started abandoning it by having the Inquisitors and all that. But they can't quite bring themselves to leave the philosophy behind, even though it is a little bit outdated. The Jedi are now so established that the Sith need more numbers, but Palpatine, they're not willing to break the rule of two.
Because the Inquisitors will eventually fade away.
Unless they're continually replenishing their numbers, which is part of the plot of Fallen Order.
I just meant by the time of the original trilogy, unless they're in the background, they're most likely not in operation.
No, I think several Inquisitors die pursuing other Jedi. Vader kills several just for mouthing off to him. Yeah. Obi-Wan Kenobi kills a couple. So I think, they have a high attrition rate, which is, I think, by design. They don't want any of them sticking around long enough to challenge Vader or the Emperor. But part of the Sith philosophy is there's always a challenger waiting. And so the challenger for the master is the apprentice, and the challenge for the apprentice is the lower level minor league people, which was either Dooku having Ventress.
And Grievous. Even though it's not exactly a dark side apprentice, it's still an apprentice figure nonetheless.
I think he's more in the political military hierarchy than in the Sith hierarchy. He's been trained in lightsaber combat, but that's about as far.
That's where it makes it foggy.
There's an interesting comic series where Grievous encounters he's very few of them is organic. Little of them is organic anymore. But he sees a force vision of himself in this light side force vergence that Dooku sends him to destroy, where it shows him how as he would have been without having made himself mechanical, as his original species. Yeah. And he bombards the place with his capital ship from orbit. But of course, he doesn't destroy the light side. It just blinks back into life. Right. So I think you have the Sith who have this, sort of notional rule of two that they would say that they're following, they really don't. By the time of the original trilogy, it's really Palpatine is what's forged the Sith into what they are right now.
Right, and for the body of the movie series, he's the figurehead of all evil. He's the patriarch. It always comes back to Palpatine.
Yeah, and they deliberately put power, ambition, and control at the top of the list of things. And so they believe that the powerful should rule. Again, it's not necessarily an evil philosophy, though I think it attracts evil people. And I think it does have an inherent, and then by using the dark side of the Force, inherently corrupts the people who use it. Though I would say some people think they're not being corrupted, but then they actually are. Yeah. And then we do have fallen Sith, like we do have fallen Jedi. Either they leave the Sith order and go their own way, and some might be redeemed, and some, I think, fade into a more gray direction. So why don't we go over our fallen Sith that we're aware of?
Yeah, so it's starting off in film, we get Maul, who starts off by closely following the Sith Order by recruiting his own apprentice in his brother, but then he divorces himself from the Sith Order to become more of a crime lord and a dark side user.
But then he can't help himself. So we'll do an episode on Maul, but he's really a Sisyphean figure in that he keeps trying to do the same things, and whenever he tries to whenever he's almost reached his goal, he falls right back to where he was and loses everything again. He gets power and loses it. He becomes the Mandalore, rules Mandalore, and loses that. Yeah. He becomes leader of the Crimson Dawn, and then loses that. And then he recruits his brother as an apprentice, and then loses him. And then he tries to be a crime boss, but he can't help himself. He goes to Malachor. He gets after being pursued by Inquisitors, and then he tries to recruit Ezra Bridger as his apprentice. For years and years, he tries.
Still following that master and apprentice trap.
Yeah, he continues refers to him as his apprentice. He tries to kill Ezra's master, and he cannot give up his vendetta against Obi-Wan Kenobi. He cannot, because revenge is one of the tenets of the Sith, and he cannot give it up. So Maul, I think, is one of example of, he's like Ahsoka on the light side, where Ahsoka leaves the Jedi Order but still holds true to many of their ideals in her own way. Maul leaves the Sith, not entirely voluntarily. Well, not voluntarily at all. He's cut in half and then left for dead. Only the dark side of the Force sustaining him, and is abandoned by Palpatine as a broken tool. But then he continues to do exactly what the Sith do. And then I think the other prime example we have in existing media is Asajj Ventress.
Yeah, she goes very great. She becomes a bounty hunter in the Clone Wars, which is nebulous in terms of ethical status.
She maintains a somewhat friendship with Ahsoka Tano after becoming a bounty hunter. She has an encounter with Boba Fett where she delivers a princess to her oppressor just for the money. She tells herself she has a code, and then we see in Dark Disciple, which we mentioned in a previous episode, it brings her story to a conclusion. Where she still believes she can tap into the dark side just as a tool, even though she's no longer part of the Sith. And she certainly seems like she's making rational decisions, but instead of the harm falling on her, she instead has a lot of harm falling on Quinlan Vos. But then she can't handle that anymore because they're in love. And so then it was interesting to see a story where love was both the reason that Quinlan Vos fell, but also the reason that Asajj Ventress was saved. In a certain point of view.
This is a total non sequitur, but just in the balance of Star Wars, I was thinking the other day about Grogu, and because Grogu's the same age as Anakin, what if Yoda is the father, and because he broke the sacred Jedi vow, there is a vergence in the Force and a dark side opponent was born to bring balance? That's just a non sequitur.
Right. So
Force users.
Yeah, I don't think we have any other examples of fallen Sith, and I think that takes our exploration of the Sith.
Anakin.
For like 10 seconds.
Yeah, Anakin and Kylo for 10 seconds or 10 minutes before he goes
Kylo for longer. Kylo has to go through a more redemption arc. But, I mean, Darth Vader redeems himself by doing what he's supposed to do as a Sith the whole time. He kills his master. He does it
for the right reasons.
True.
Not for power, but for the protection of his son.
So, yeah, technically a fallen Sith in that he comes back, and he does return as a light side Force ghost as Anakin Skywalker.
Do you think that is earned?
So I think the point of that is that there's no kind of like scale where in life we assume like there must be some amount of repentance or redemption necessary to then wash away someone's sins. But the Force is beyond such balancing acts. And so the fact that Anakin Skywalker truly touched into the Force and did a light side forcing of his life, it did not erase any of the bad things that he did. And the damage that he did continues and causes the fall of his son later.
Yeah.
Or the fall of his grandson. But it also allowed him to rejoin the Force, and he did not cling to his own. As we can discuss on other dark side users and Sith, we should talk about the Sith Master from Visions. From the Master and the Apprentice episode. Master and the Padawan.
And so interesting just because we have this, for those of you who've not seen Visions, this is the episode I've seen. I need to see the rest. But in brief, we have this Force user defend a town from a Sith bandit, and he turns out to be a fellow Sith. And I don't think ever before, outside of Clone Wars, have we seen Siths combat.
Yeah, we see Asajj Ventress attack, or in Maul, attack Dooku.
We've had Palpatine attack Maul and his brother, Savage. Yeah, it was so interesting to see this Sith figure who, I don't know, did anything altruistic, even if it was for like moderately personal gain.
Yeah, and he deliberately sets himself. He's almost like the Ronin. He's a Ronin character. He comes up. He's like the wandering warrior. He saves the town, and he does. You don't know what reasons he's doing it for, but he has a red lightsaber.
But he defeats his opponent pretty brutally and pretty underhandedly, though she deserved it.
That's another example of Sith. And then it's an episode of Visions you haven't seen, but there's another ancient Sith master that appears in another episode of Visions, where he, in the High Republic period, where he's fights a master and an apprentice Jedi together. And it's implied he's clung to life for centuries beyond his lifespan, to the point where when he dies, his body turns. It's like an inverse of what happens with Yoda, where his body vanishes. The Sith master's body turns to like blackened dirt.
Gross.
Like he decomposes centuries all at once.
Well, the dark side is the pathway to powers some might seem.
Please, Connor, we're doing a Star Wars podcast. The dark side is a pathway to many abilities that some would consider unnatural. All right, so yeah, I think that takes us over the Sith. And Kylo Ren is not really a Sith. He's never Darth Kylo. We'll talk about him with the Knights of Ren.
He's an offshoot. I always thought, just from the films, that the Knights of Ren were just his acquaintances from the Jedi Order, but it turns out they were a separate order, if you read the comics.
Yeah, I need to get to that far. We'll talk about them in brief.
Yeah, in vague, they're servants of an unknown region's master who turns out to be Snoke. And their origins are unknown, but they recruit Kylo or Ben Solo at that point, into their knighthood. They don't get anything to do in the movies, and apparently none in Resistance, which they could have.
Oh no, they don't show up at all in Resistance.
Yeah, this is what else are you going to do in that show? They're decked out in the trappings of the dark side, not specifically, Sith relics, but they might not even be apparently Force sensitive. I think literature and the DK books say that they are, but they're just cool looking guys in the trappings of the dark side. The only philosophical take we get about where the dark side is at is with Kylo, his ambitions and his communications with Snoke, which again, it's following this personal seizure of power and exercising that over the galaxy.
Yeah, so Snoke does not call himself a Sith. He may or may not be a rejected clone of Palpatine, but he definitely has his own ambitions and goals. He uses Force lightning. We see that he's a very powerful dark side Force user. He has this cadre of Force sensitive people that joined him and helped him destroy the nascent Jedi Order after the fragmentation of the New Republic. We don't really know much more about him beyond that, what his philosophy is, though it seems to pair fairly close to Sith philosophy. I mean, literally his apprentice murders him and takes his place as supreme leader. There's a deliberately, I think, more of a political bent to Snoke than there was for the Sith. Sith would often seize political power as a means of expediency, whereas Snoke deliberately built himself a state, the First Order, through which to support it. It's a much more deliberately fascist vision of what the dark side can do, rather than simply
it's not a natural creation of this empire. With the First Order and the Last Order in The Rise of Skywalker is this, I'm powerful enough to cull resources and manipulate the people in order to get my First Order up and running. It's not this slow game over 50 years of maneuvering the chess pieces to turn the Republic into the First Galactic Empire.
Yeah, and the First Order is parts of the Empire, and especially the Outer Rim, that broke away. But Palpatine had laid the seeds for that, even when he was still alive. So there's not a whole else to say about the Knights of Ren, other than they appear to be an alternate dark side force, but don't really have any other particular things. We know much more. Going on to our next, I would say, dark side force users would be the Nightsisters of Dathomir.
The snooze of the Star Wars universe for Futurama fans.
Well, it is the only force-sensitive people that receive training on Dathomir. Because Maul is a force-sensitive native of Dathomir. They're one of the Zabrak species. So the women are all trained, if they are force sensitive, to become Nightsisters, and even the ones that aren't force sensitive are still trained in their weaponry. And men live separately, except for purposes of procreation and such. So it's a very stratified and rigid society, which, as you notice, is sort of a theme for any kind of enduring force sensitive population, is they have lots of rules and rituals to prevent the manifestations of the Force from in any one person from destroying their society.
And in this way, if you can imagine if the Night Sisters allowed their males to become Darth Mauls, that might be an aggressive kind of society. So the Night Sisters are greatly matriarchal. They have, is it the Grand Night Mother?
No, they just call her Mother. But yes, the leader of the Night Sisters, when we meet them, is Mother Talzin. She is the one who accepts Asajj Ventress back after she leaves Dooku, heals her, and enhances her Force powers, and trains her from the rudimentary Sith training that Dooku was allowed to give her, and also trains her in the ways of the Force that the Dathomir know. And they deliberately refer to their manifestations of the Force as magic.
Makes me think of Han Solo and his hokey wizards and my misquotes, but the Night Sisters exercise an entirely different skill set, an entirely different power base. I think the Night Sister is much more about possession. She has some necromantic abilities. She's, I believe, manipulated zombies before.
Yeah, so some of the powers of the Night Sisters include that we witness both. There is a allied Night Sister character in Fallen Order who you meet, who is not implied to be using the dark side. So it's not certain if the magic or powers that the Night Sisters use is inherently the dark side, or if their society has reached the point where they regularly use the dark side by the time that we meet them. Because they certainly are dark side by the time. I mean, they practice necromancy, and then they embalm their dead, and then they don't bring them back to life, but the corpses do mindlessly follow the control of the person who raises them back. They can make themselves invisible, both themselves, and at one point, Night Sister even makes an entire ship invisible to sensors using a ritual. It's very ritual. There's often this green glow that accompanies magic, and a lot of it seems to be tied to either the planet of Dathomir, but we also see it happen just fine off of Dathomir. So I think it's not really exactly tied to the planet, but they deliberately remained insular as a means of protecting themselves. Because when the one time they interfered in politics, Palpatine sent General Grievous and committed one of his many acts of genocide. Only a few Night Sisters survived, and there were not many of them to begin with.
They have the ability through ritual to give the Night Brothers steroids and turn them into massive man-beast creatures, like we see Savage Opress turn into. One of my favorite Clone Wars characters. He's voiced by Mr. Krabs. So, that fact in itself. But just his blind following of Maul and his just
physical
brutality.
Presence. Yeah. So, they're able to, grow, physically change people's bodies. Like, they fix Maul's prosthetics after he's brought to them. So they much more focused on the body, and they do engage in several Night Sister rituals in Dark Disciple as well to help Quinlan Vos get more power to fight Dooku. It doesn't work because Dooku is ultimately even more powerful on the dark side. But they have rituals where they immerse themselves in water and contact ancient dark side entities. But then we even see the Mother Talzin dies, but much like in one of the previous episodes we talked about a Sith who bound his essence to a mask, we see Mother Talzin beyond death having bound her soul to an object and attempting to resurrect herself in a complicated ritual.
Very Harry Potter.
Which is directed by Mace Windu and Jar Jar Binks in equal measure, and she's stopped from coming back to life after her death at the hands of General Grievous.
So I just appreciate how complete this view of this Force offshoot is. It's kind of like in Avatar: The Last Airbender when you see the Mudbenders for the first time. You have these waterbenders.
The foggy swamp people?
Yeah, they live on neither pole, so they're not near either of the tribes for the waterbenders, yet they can bend water. It's just an entirely different cultural sphere. Yeah,
and I like that they build a culture for them. They have the society, and you can see both the ways in which the planet that they live on has shaped their society, and then the way that has shaped their understanding of the Force, and then the way to need to protect themselves, so the manifestations of the Force have enforced things like this rigid matriarchy, this stratified society, these rituals in this insular society where only to protect themselves, they give up one of their Force-sensitive daughters to a warlord. They give who eventually becomes Asajj Ventress. They give up one of their Force-sensitive sons to Palpatine in exchange for being left alone. Because Palpatine, of course, is aware of their existence. And they know that he's Sith. But otherwise, Dathomir largely goes unnoticed. And they confine their activities to one planet. Which I think is something interesting that the Clone Wars episode showed more of, is that there is this monoculture that exists in the Republic. But far more often, most people in Star Wars don't leave their home planet, and there
Right.
are all these local cultures that thrive and exist on millions of planets.
Part of the beauty of Star Wars, yeah. Just even the worst Star Wars movies, Rise of Skywalker, you'll see planets with cultures that are so unique and colorful and beautiful. Or just you get to see them ravaged, like when we see the sequence that's very much like World War II and the First Order going from door to door trying to find our heroes. Just something that Star Wars can do very well, where in a Marvel story, you might be in New York or in San Francisco. But in Star Wars, you can always go to a different planet and always start to just give a tiny little peek at a culture that's been around for thousands of years.
Yeah, definitely Star Wars has a sense of everything is old. Whereas even when Marvel tries, they don't quite manage that. It's like, yes, this is the skull of a celestial nowhere, and it's like, but nothing looks old.
Yeah.
And there's a bar here, and we're playing, nope, but here, Ronin cereal, let's get back to the plot.
Right. Everything's neon.
So, yes, that has been our discussion of the Sith and other dark side practitioners. Join us next time for looking at Force users who are not Jedi or Sith, but fall somewhere in between.
Thank you so much for listening. We've been talking Star Wars. We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.